Hello, Patricia Barry.
Hello, Jessica Letaw. Greetings, everybody. This is Patricia Barry from Patricia Barry Consulting and Jessica Letaw. Um, what are you of these days?
I am of nowhere in particular. I am of housing justice. That's what I am
Free
of.
range housing justice advocate and general overall badass, Jessica Letaw. And what we're gathering here is to talk about this wonderful book by Sarah Rao and Regina Jackson.
Syra.
Syra Rao, thank you, I appreciate that. Called White Women, Everything You Already Know About Your Own Racism and How to Do Better. And what we're going to be doing in this conversation, not only having a great conversation with my beloved friend, Jessica Lita, but also kind of giving you and cluing you into our methodology about how we have loving conversations with other white women in our networks and our families and our friend groups that holds both love and accountability around this racism work. It's one of the things that sometimes I find the most difficult, and very grateful, Jess, for coming into this and helping me create some norms and some boundaries so that I can do that with a whole host of people. So that's what the purpose of these LinkedIn Lives conversations are, is both to talk about them as well as to just give you an example of how you might use this in your own work, your own family, your own communities. So to kick us off, let's ground ourselves in where and who we are and what brought us to this moment. And I'm going to open the floor to Jessica.
Mhm. So I'll get to this moment in a moment, but I wanted to back up a little bit and talk about how I got into doing anti racism work, which is that for a long time I didn't. I thought I got a pass out of needing to do anything around race because I grew up poor, because I was queer in the South, because I was a woman anywhere. Like I thought all of those were enough to contend with and enough to work on, and that I would just sort of get in the way of working on what I thought of at the time. And I cringe at saying this, and I also feel like I need to kind of look myself in the eye about it, talking about minority issues, and felt like it was better left to minority people. So when race sort of began escalating in profile and frequency in mainstream conversations, I went looking for writings and art by people of color and women of color that would validate my position, that would say, yes, you are a woman, you are clearly in the struggle with us. Thank you for being here. As long as we all show up for each other, that's all we need. And Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Audre Lorde and Martin Luther King and so many other people, folks I already knew and respected, had been talking about whiteness all along. And that came as a surprise to me. I either had totally glossed over or had never seen their writings and thinkings around whiteness and white folks. They were critical of white people, implicating white moderates, white progressives, and frequently, above all, white women for continuing to
Jessica,
enforce the
can
status
I
quo.
ask you to pause just 1 minute? I'm sorry, we're having one technical question
Mhm.
that I'm not sure why, but I'm not hearing anything. And also checking to see if anybody else is having any technical issues. I'm going to just check LinkedIn really quickly. We're using StreamYard, but if you are having issues, oh, wait, Michelle Waters reports that she can hear. Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate that. Okay, back to our regular scheduled conversation because I see from Susan that she can hear now as well. All right,
Oh,
thank
great.
you.
Great, great, great. Michelle and Susan and LinkedIn user, thank you for helping us. Appreciate that. Um, so, what I'm saying is, I thought being a woman was enough. And it turns out being a white woman had a special sort of implication, especially when it comes to race work. And this is when I discovered white feminism, the concept of it, the problems with it, and the fact that I was actively working to uphold it. And that still like really gives me a tightness to acknowledge about myself. It's really frustrating. Um, so that I often say is the moment that I discovered that I was a white woman. And that being a woman not only didn't excuse me from anti racism work, it actually invites me into it. And that white womanhood in particular holds a very specific place in enforcing and upholding racial systems of racial oppression. And that is still something that's difficult for me to contend with, less so now from a sense of like oppressive guilt and overwhelm, and more just feeling like, all right, let's go, let's go, let's go. Let's figure out what all of this work looks like. So I am a white cis woman. Other privileges that I hold are education. I have a master's level education, socioeconomic. I am not housing, food, or safety insecure, and verbal, which is not one that's typically brought into play, but I think it's important to recognize that I write and speak in a way that culture tells people to take seriously, and that is very much privilege.
Wonderful. Well, I'm going to ground myself in this work. I felt like I came a little late to the anti racism work. I had been working in what I considered at the time was a nice person doing. I was a fundraising professional. I was raising money for organizations that I felt like were doing really great in the world. And when I moved to Detroit, I suddenly had my eyes opened, my boundaries expanded into thinking about white privilege and thinking about concepts of anti-racism, meeting people like Jess Letaw, and suddenly getting a more critical on what I was doing as a fundraising professional for billion-dollar fundraising campaigns and organizations. There was a really strong white-centered, white-privileged, um, toxic approach going on. And I began to really question it. Definitely had started my career thinking about relationships. I didn't want to do transactional fundraising. And then that suddenly transformed into anti-racist work and to think about power sharing when exchanging wealth with donors and individuals for nonprofit organizations, and how we can exploit those organizations or those recipients and give a better power dynamic with the donor as partner and not the donor as holding a carrot that these organizations really needed and that they needed to be subservient to in order to gain the wealth that they needed in order. So along with that came very uncomfortable realizations. I had blindly enacting my privilege as a white female while identifying as somebody who was marginalized because I was female. So that was a huge eye opener for me. I think that I had always felt like I was very strongly a part of the feminist movement, and then had a big realization that, oh no, I was part of the white feminist movement, which was oppressing other people. So this work has been tremendous, comfortable, and I think rightly so. But it is the work that I definitely do. And Jess, as a beloved friend and a community member, is definitely in a different part of her journey in this work. Has been doing it for years, whereas I am relatively, within the last 10 years, have been digging into this more. So she has just become really a beloved community member and has caused me to recurate my family and community, particularly among my white women, amongst me, about other people that I can have these kind of conversations with that are sometimes hard and sometimes uncomfortable. And whether we're holding somebody else accountable or somebody's holding me accountable, like those can be uncomfortable moments that I've not been enculturated to handle gracefully. So this is the work, and this kind of conversation that Jess has so generously entered into with me has really been a foundation for my learning in a way that feels very expansive.
And I do want to
So
say that yes, this work is uncomfortable, and that is sort of intrinsic to it. But I don't do it because it's uncomfortable. And I kind of don't do it in spite of it being uncomfortable. It just is what it is. I'm not just here for Black folks and people of color. I am here because systems of racial oppression oppress all of us. And that a toxic culture is toxic for all of us. White people do not get a pass from that toxicity. So I am here for my liberation too. I am here to set myself free. I am here to set the white women that I love and I want well for us. I want good for us, sometimes better than what we want for ourselves. Like, I want us to be set free, and that must be done in sisterhood, and that must be done, in camaraderie and solidarity with the folks around us. So mindful solidarity. I also want to say
And
we're
go, please.
I just wanted to say, sorry.
We're trying to get out of our like scripted mode and get into like conversate. I'm just going to name that too.
But I did want to say for folks following along online, we are going to have a Q&A at the end. And so if you're having questions or things that you're holding, please feel free to drop them into the chat. And also feel free not to wait on us. Like, feel free to have a conversation with each other, because this conversation doesn't start with Patricia and I, and it doesn't end here. And part of what we're hoping is to build a community of us and help us be having these kind of broader, more honest conversations with each other. So all of that to say, the last 15, 20 minutes of our conversation, we will open to questions and comments. So feel free to be dropping them in as we go along. Mm-hmm. So if I can bring us back to what we thought we were up to, Patricia, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what brought us to this book, and kind of help people think about or understand our thinking around why we chose this format to talk about it.
Oh, that's a good question. So certainly for me, it was trying to find something that felt real to do on Women's History Month, that was about my interest in intersectional feminism and about the way I learned. And so Syra Rao and Regina Jackson did a wonderful open-ended, you could get this book for free, and now I'm forgetting the name of the form that offered that. So I took them up on it and said I wanted to do a reading group, and I really didn't enter for it. And then my beloved friend Jess said, I would really love to do that with you. And then Jess like brought the fire and helped us like consolidate what we were going to do, and even figuring out the technology. One of the reasons I love doing this on LinkedIn is because during the pandemic, I really recurated my LinkedIn file, because I was tired of kind of being in this echo chamber of fundraisers, talking to fundraisers about congratulate me on my next business, that I started leaning into people that I was finding inspiring. And there's this entire social justice conversation about what it means to be professional, what it means to be anti-racist in the work world that's happening on LinkedIn. And I really encourage people to like start going outside your network, start going outside your field. People are really talking in big and important ways about what it means to work and what it means to be yourself at work and be comfortable and cared for is a hard word. I don't think that's what I'm trying, but just belonging, to be able to belonging. Thank you. That's a better word. At work. So that's the reason that I was really excited about doing this on LinkedIn, because it's a real conversation with this community that I was learning such a great deal from. So, and Jess, what did you think?
I'm here because you had the great idea to do this. I mean, I saw the book come up, and of course it was on my TBR pile, and I knew that I would get to it. And when you said that you wanted to have a conversation around it, I knew that I wanted to have the conversation around you, and I was going to follow you to wherever that conversation was. So here we are. And you and I have been in community, and we have worked professionally on a number of different projects and organizations together. And you and I have held each other in loving accountability for a long time. We are able to kind of hold space for a lot of complicated things together. And so I knew that this is something that I could move into with trust, with accountability, with courage, because it's with you. And then for me, I really want to get better at holding space to name and dismantle whiteness, and not just in myself, because I'm a good white woman. I've been doing, and a good woman, like I've been working on myself for a really long time. But I want to do it not just on myself. And not just in spaces that I control. I want to get better at doing this work in exclusively or majority white spaces, and in doing this work in ways that don't cause harm in spaces that are mixed or majority people of color. And part of what I'm saying is that I want to get less comfortable. I want to get less
Yes.
surgical about where and with whom I'm having these conversations, and more open about it, because I think the more conversations that I have about race with women who are sort of not as close to my immediate professional and social circle, the harder they find it to talk about race at all or with me. And I think that we as a culture need to get better at this with everyone that we're talking to. And I can't ask that of other people until I learn to navigate that and enter into that myself.
And I love what you're saying about discomfort. Our run up to this conversation, like, I mean, Jess knows that we were both kind of like feeling really anxious. And I'll tell you from my perspective, I am an old lady who started a business at 50 years old, and I recognize that every time I have a conversation, clients fall off. And then you create space for the clients that are resonant with my values. But clients falling off, is a scary thing, which is another reason that I felt like it was important to have this on LinkedIn, because particularly as I think about this and I think about my privilege, I have to ask myself the question, like, what mistakes am I willing to make? Big public mistakes to conversation in a meaningful way. And what economically, personally, professionally am I to put at stake to be a learner who is inviting other learners to come along with us? Like, we're all at different points of our journey, but it's more than necessary, both for our own health and well-being and the well-being of our community. So that fear and anxiety was definitely an interesting week-long conversation that Jess and I were having. We were coming up to this space about, we're going to kind of put it all out there. So I encourage y'all to do that too. Fear is a big one.
Fear's a big one. And speaking for myself, I will say that largely my fear did not center around the racial component of this. I've been talking about whiteness and race for long enough that I'm never going to say I have found all the ways to be uncomfortable or get things wrong, but I have done my best. But I'm still sitting here like in a half sweat through shirt. And a lot of that is because I'm shifting the forum. In the past, I have been very careful about curating my conversations about race, my in-depth conversations around race, with friends and colleagues with whom I had an established relationship. And there's some good reasons for that, right? Like, we understand that the science of people changing their minds demonstrates that we often do not do it unless and until we're in relationship with someone whose interest we are vested in and who we believe has our best interests at heart as well. So that's a part of it. Part of it is I wanted to be hedging these conversations away from people of color so they weren't exposed to the learning, uncomfortable, but can be harmful for Black folks and other people of color to watch white folks acknowledge the problematic behavior that we've had, the harm that we've caused. That can be harmful. And so I have not wanted to add to that harm. At this point, I am perfectly trusting that anyone who feels like they would be harmed by this conversation will stay away from it. Hopefully not the white folks, but you know what I mean? And I also feel like waiting on those relationships to have those conversations is another way I am tending to my comfort. And so shifting away from those formats into this one is a part of my learning and a part of my sweating. So
And
that's okay.
can I ask because you just used a term that I know that I've just recently or a concept that I've just recently got into, and it was the white right to comfort. Do you have a brief unpacking of that just for anybody else who's kind of in the same place that I am?
I do, and I'm so glad you asked that. I will drop a link in the chat, or excuse me, in the comments after this event is over, which is I don't think it's the gifts of conflict, but it has to do with sort of embracing conflict as a generative element of any kind of meaningful work with each other, and not just justice work, not just race work, any work. If we're doing it like all the way down to the nuts and bolts, probably will entail some kind of conflict. And so it's a workbook around that. And within that workbook, it has some descriptions around what it calls dominant culture, some folks call white culture characteristics. It's not unique to this book. There are a lot of resources and a lot of people that talk about aspects of white culture. And Patricia, I'm so glad you asked about that. One of the reasons that we have a hard time, we as white folks have a hard time talking about race, is that whiteness has been invisibilized. We have taken whiteness as the benchmark, just like we have taken cisgender, folks who are born male identify as male, born female identify as female, cisgender as the benchmark, so much so that it wasn't until recently that cis folks even knew we had a word for cis. At least I didn't, speaking for myself. And so along with white culture comes a number of different conventions, behaviors that many of us use that we were implicitly taught, rarely explicitly, in order to be able to uphold those norms. And mandating that we are comfortable while we learn is one of those characteristics. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that at you so loudly.
Well, so here's what I'll name is you and I kind of broke up the work of getting this thing out into the world. And one of the things that you asked me to do is like, what are going to be our cultural norms and our working agreements, right? Selves, and what we're asking for our online community. And I really had to fight with myself because the first one I wanted to put out there was be nice. And then I realized that is so not helpful. I'm not asking people to be mean. Don't get me, but that niceties culture, I think, is that one of those cores, particularly white women upholding white women doing work, is that it's not that we're being unkind to each other, but that really unhelpful construction of nice is not the work. The work is we're all going to be a little uncomfortable. We're going to ask questions. I hope we're all going to assume good intent. So with that being love to get into, because we're getting close to our Q&A portion of our program, I'd love for talk through our working agreements. And this is a great way to start any conversation. I start it with my beloved, my significant other. If we're going to have a heart, I'll say, can we agree how we're going to do this? And we'll state what our agreement is going into the mission, and then we'll try to do it. So it's really helpful to give a framework to conversations. So Jess, I'll turn it over to you to talk about our working agreements that we developed.
For sure. And you and I have had working agreements in different forums that we've been in. When I ran a nonprofit, I had working agreements with my board and with the whole organization. And we would actually reiterate those every single time we entered into it. There are a couple of community groups and coalitions that I'm in that have working agreements with each other. And the idea is that you create them together. It's not a set of rules that you adhere to no matter what, and you're like, here are my 10, this is how you deal with me. No, you attend to the space
you will
that
be
you're
put
in
conversational jail.
Yeah. So there's that. So attending to the place you're in, the time you're in, the people that you're with, co-creating those working agreements is really key to be able to sink into substantive work and difficult conversations. To that end, Patricia and I have co-created our working agreements for this and the subsequent conversations. And we are open to changing those as we go along with each other, especially if we see that we need to add to some. But again, I'll drop the link to the Working Through Conflict workbook in the comments after this. But you'll see that under the white culture characteristics section, I pretty directly drew from that in making sure that Patricia and I are not continuing to reinforce problematic cultural norms in having difficult conversations. So I'll open with the first one, which is safety versus courage. Over the course of this series, I imagine we'll get into some of the reasons behind this, but today, for the sake of brevity, I just want to say that we do not have the right to comfort in this learning. So this space, this conversational space, is not a safe space because the world that we're trying to address with it is not safe. This is a brave space. I want to invite Patricia and I into loving accountability. We have known each other and loved each other for a long time. Let us love each other enough to tell the truth and to hold up mirrors that need holding up, because kindness and honesty are not mutually exclusive.
I love that. So another expectation and norm that we have is pacing. I would like to invite us to ask for the pace we need. Speaking for myself, while I'm doing deep learning, I often go a little slower and I don't always know the right answer or even what I think about it. So I need the time to kind of mull on new ideas, and sometimes it has to sink in and maybe I have to sleep on it. But I want to allow us each other the time that we need to think as well as speak. I also want to talk a little bit about binary thinking, because this is something that I am in a process of deep unlearning. I come from a place where you're either right or wrong. So I would like to invite us into a place to resist black and white thinking, except talking about race. I want us to resist right and wrong. I want us to resist, or I would just like us to resist those concepts, because this is just the work.
And then the last one for now that we've talked about is conflict. In dominant culture in the Midwest, where Patricia and I are as women, sort of pick your identity, we are frequently rewarded for being nice instead of being real, and for being conciliatory instead of leaning into disagreement and complexity. And so in this conversation, I would like to invite us to allow a lot of emotional space to be in conflict with each other, with the ideas being presented, and maybe most especially ourselves. I fully expect to disagree with myself.
Well, and change. I'm thinking of Yodit Mesfin Johnson from Nonprofit Enterprise at Work said a wonderful thing to me, a couple years ago, which was, if she was held accountable for what she felt years ago, that, it just wouldn't be helpful. We learn better, we do better, we transform, we move forward. So yes, I think that that's an important concept for me too. And just in the last couple minutes, Jess, I would love to talk back from this 8-week experience. You and I are going to come out here on LinkedIn Live, and how can we invite others to work with us? So what are you expecting this experience to be like, I think?
What I'm expecting for myself and for this space. So for myself, I'm expecting continue to build the muscle of talking to white people about race. At this point, I work in housing justice, I work in environmental spaces, I work in community building spaces. I'm really good at talking about race and how race is implicated in the problems that I work on. I am less good at talking about whiteness in particular. And I am not as strong as I'd like to be in talking about whiteness to people I know, especially not the ones that I've known as long as I've known you or have worked with as closely as you and I have worked together. So I'd like to continue to build that muscle in talking about whiteness to white people, which includes addressing individual behaviors that I see in groups and organizations and systems that I'm in. That is something that I continue to find difficult, up to and including this morning, is when I'm seeing something, how do I say something?
Ugh, I just rang my bell. It's like, ah, I don't know how to do that. Like I do it imperfectly, and I'm committed to doing it in person, figure out a way to do it better, but just do it, right? But online, in person, somebody tells a joke or somebody's talking about something that, oh, so uncomfortable, and I recognize that that's a really problematic way to frame it. How do I do that? Is still very much my work in progress. And when I think about what I expect from this experience, it's really just continuous learning. I want to be Patricia 2.0 at the end of it, recognizing that every other engagement that I do adds one other 0.1 point to my knowledge and deepening of me as a thriving human and a great community member who is an active example of deep love for the values that I hold. So that's what I'm hoping out of reading this book, and I'm hoping that you all will come along. It's interesting, Jess. I don't know. Oh, are we going to open to a Q&A now? It's
we
2
will in a
o'clock.
second. Yeah, we will switch in just
Okay.
a second. But I realized that I have one other hope, which is that, as I said a second ago, I can struggle to address behaviors, when I see them, the moment that I see them. And some of that is for personal factors, and some of that is because I'm still like unbaking the whiteness and white culture characteristics out from my own behavior. I am hoping and expecting that this book is going to raise my urgency around those behaviors and walk me away from comfort and like, oh, but I don't want so and so to respect me less or to stop listening because they think that I'm haranguing them. I will absolutely harangue people about the climate crisis. I will tell people to their face, the planet is burning, turn your car off. And yet I am softer spoken about whiteness to white people, and I am attendant to that. And I am hoping and looking forward to the book kind of resetting me a little bit around that.
And I also just want to, we'll post it in the comments when we're done, but I would love to point everybody to Syra and Regina's organization, which is race2dinner.com. And we'll put that out in the comment, but it's a really beautiful conception of how to have difficult conversations with people that you love and respect. So I encourage you to both read the book as well as check out their website. So Q&A.
So for the folks who are joining us virtually, I hope that if you have questions, you'll feel free to drop them in there. Include the uncomfortable ones, right? That's our working agreement. We have dropped the right to comfort in this learning, but I will start the conversation with some questions and comments that I got leading up to this. So I circulated the fact that Patricia and I were having this event with some of my professional and social circles ahead of time. And I'm so glad I did, because I got an email back within 5 minutes that said, are you not aware, and I'm quoting her, are you not aware that this activity is racist and sexist? And I asked her permission to put this question in this conversation. She said yes. I asked her comfort around sharing her name, and she said no, thank you. And so, are you not aware that this activity is racist and sexist? And I'll say two things about that. One is that to talk about race and to talk about sex does not inherently make you racist and sexist. In fact, we need to have an honest engagement with those ideas if we acknowledge that there are problems around them, pay gap, health disparities, income outcomes, educational outcomes. If we accept that disparities exist, that problems exist, we have to be able to talk about them. So talking race and sex is not inherently racist and sexist. To understand what makes something racist and sexist involves understanding that those concepts are talking about power. That in the social construct of race, not in the physical construct of race, as in I have one skin color, my friend Teresa has another, but in the social construct of race, certain races carry more and less power, and that's socially is how we constructed it. How we talk about that and work on that is where being racist and sexist shows up. And I think that I will let a longer answer wait for how we get into the book. But because that was the first question, and because I thought it really got to the heart of what we're doing, I did want to bring it up here.
That's great. And you and I have been kind of like mulling that over too as it was posed to us. And I felt like there was a really meaty conceptualization in that. Like, why isn't it right that we're only talking to other white women? And the baseline understanding that it's our responsibility to do the work without tasking the BIPOC community to educate us. You know, there's certainly
and BIPOC,
things
just
that...
real quick, is Black, Indigenous, and other people of color.
Correct. Thank you. So yeah, like, how do we do our own work as well? Like, obviously we're going to be in community, you know, and things in community, but rather than tasking the person that we have questions about their cultural identity with unpacking their cultural identity for, yeah. So I have a couple questions. Can I pull them out from the chat? Are you ready? So
Yep.
Truly Render asks,
and I'm going to put it up on screen as well.
Oh, perfect. A common example of how loving accountability has taken shape in your relationship in real time. So I can give you a really good example that Jess did for me. He came into this space. I mispronounced Syra's name, Syra Rao. And Jess, who knew the answer because she had looked it up and had done the phonetic looking of the name, corrected me. And rather than turning that into a whip, I accepted the correction, and then I moved forward with that. So even in just a very moment, that is loving accountability. I know that Jess's intentions in setting me straight on a thing that I was not aware of or that I was using incorrectly, part of her loving me and wanting me to do better in this community. So some of that is based on trust, and some of it is also based on how I receive that. Jess, I'll throw it over to you and see if you have an example that you'd like to give to Truly.
I do, and if it's okay with you and Truly, I'll give an example that happened to me very recently outside of our relationship, with in a relationship where I was less fully grounded in the space, although we do and did have working agreements, which was helpful. I was in a meeting that was with a steering committee for a larger group to talk about the agenda for a future meeting and a conflict that we were having within the steering committee. And it was a majority white group with 3 Black people in there. And the conversation opened with the facilitator of the group really kind of grounding us in the agenda setting and wanting to focus on the agenda setting. And I noticed that all the white folks piled in on, yes, let's talk about the agenda setting. And I knew that the conflict was around both race and power. And so I asked in the moment, can we please redirect and address this conflict first? Because I feel like until we're doing that, we are assigning ourselves the right to comfort, and we are not letting ourselves sink into the real work. And I'm not sure that we're going to build an agenda that holds fidelity to what this group really wants to do until we kind of unpack this conflict with each other. So that was a deeply uncomfortable moment, and I'm very proud of myself for doing it. And it did redirect the group. We were in minute 40 of a 45-minute meeting at the point where I did that redirection, and it opened another 2 hours of conversation. And you know what? We needed it. So that's an example.
And can I just reflect on a couple things I notice in that retelling of the story? There's a bodily moment. When you're in that moment of, I need to do something that's going to be about love and accountability, and I do it, you usually have a physical reaction. So if you remember, Jess, do you remember any place in your body that gave you an indication that there's work to be done?
I have to give a lot of credit to my therapist on this. I've been, in the last several years, I've been engaging in a therapeutic mode called somatic therapy, which has to do with bringing the body into the emotional and intellectual work that you are doing, that I am doing around just health and healing. This is a widely adopted practice. I'm very lucky to that my practitioner and I have a long practice together. And so at this point, I have a fair amount of experience of trusting my body and listening to it in difficult conversations, which also means I am actually significantly less anxious than I used to be. And I have less of that like tight ball of, oh Godness, that what's coming. So in that moment, it actually wasn't about the body. That was, I'm checking with myself to see if I'm being honest. I was frustrated. I was frustrated because I felt like I was continuing to see white culture characteristics playing out again in a group that has dedicated ourselves to kind of extricating them from how we work with each other. But that wasn't a body moment for me. There are plenty of them. I've had a couple in our conversation today, but that moment for me was not one.
And so you're, like I said, much further along in your journey of racism work than I am. And one of the things that I'm doing now is I recognize that I have a bodily reaction when something needs to be addressed, but I don't always have the words right away. Sometimes what I'll do, and this is a really tender, exposing thing to do, it always happens right here. Notice, like, whenever I'm talking about something deeply, I usually go right there. And it's like a little tightness in my chest, right in this region, which is my body saying to me, something's going on. And if I don't have words for that, I will pause the meeting or the interaction, and I will simply ground myself in that with the other person. I will say, you know what, I'm feeling something. I'm having an emotion around that's showing up in my chest. Do you mind if we just for a minute and reflect on what we just said and unpack it a little bit? I don't know what's catching me. I know that there's something catching me, and there's something that I feel like we need to work out. So, speaking as somebody who's willing to do this deeply and perfectly, it's a way to get us to stop, and whoever it is that I'm in conversation with, to get us to stop and also give me a little minute to reflect on what is that I would like to use in order to call this conversation and unpack it a little bit. Mm-hmm. So those are just two questions. Mm-hmm. I think we have another question in the queues. Jess, if you want to pull that up. So Susan says, do you imagine the book or our conversations will help us wrestle through how we are rewarded for fitting into white culture? How to hold this dichotomy? I don't know. I'll be really honest, I started reading the book yet. But I'm going to imagine that the kind of work that we're doing here in this conversation is going to help us do that, because we're going to be honest about it. Jess, what do you feel like about that conversation or that question?
Like you, I haven't started reading the book yet, but I follow Syra and Regina on Instagram, and they often both post on Instagram and repost from their Twitters, which is helpful. And they have been sharing comments that they've gotten from white women who have read or are reading the book. And Susan, to your point, I think that's exactly what the book does. I think that it helps us get at the fact that we receive power and benefit and credibility for the ways we are absolutely rewarded for compliance, right? We are absolutely rewarded for compliance. And I think that the book both names the kind of mechanisms of compliance, and I don't want to say offers invitations. I think that it's a little bit more direct than that, but gives us a path forward to being a little bit more unruly.
Yeah. So we have one last question that's really quick, and then I think if you and I just talk about what people can expect in our next LinkedIn Live and how they can follow along on their own, might be a helpful way to say thanks, y'all. So Greta had a question about will the format for all of these be LinkedIn Lives? The answer to that is they're recorded. They are going to be LinkedIn Lives, but they will be recorded and you'll have access to them later. And I encourage you to have conversations with your community from some of the ideas that get sparked through there. Jess, did you have any additionals to that question?
Not to that question. Thank you for responding
Okay.
to it. I did want to bring up one that I got from my physical therapist this morning, which I thought was awesome, and that I also heard many, many times. And so I wanted to bring it into our space, which is, she said, she also, like me, she lives in Ann Arbor, where we all feel like we are the good white people. A few years ago, she ordered and read the book White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. She said, I read it. She said, I had to go really slow because it was very intense. And I had to keep putting it down. In my mind, I heard white comfort. But she finished the book. She said, but now I'm afraid to talk about race because I feel like I'm getting everything wrong. And I completely validate that. Right.
I'm going to give that 2 thumbs up. I'm totally there. I don't know what I'm doing.
Right. So yes, afraid to talk about race because I feel like I'm getting everything wrong. And for just a second, I don't know if this is Socratic method or devil's advocate. I'm not even sure I know the difference between the two, but like, how do you imagine you're going to get better unless we do it badly first? And I will never claim that I am good at talking about race. I will only ever claim that I've done it a lot and that I've made a lot of mistakes, and will continue to make some in the series. And I look forward not to messing up. I don't think that I will ever embrace the fact that in order to get better at something, you have to suck at it first.
And look, you have to suck at it first.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yep. It's just, that's just, it's going to be practice, right?
Right. So that's one way to say it. But then I think a softer way that I'll offer, or softer language, is that messy middle is just a part of anything. It's a part of building anything physical. You can't build a car engine unless you get covered in engine oil, right? You cannot do anything creative unless you cover yourself with your creative process. And you cannot get better at talking about race until you talk about race. And a part of that is going to be doing it badly and making mistakes. And you know what? What better way than to do it in community with other white women who are having the same fears and worries than you are? Might as well do it here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And on that note, so we're going to, next week, we're going to do this. Jess, could you remind me what time we're going to do this?
We're going to do it at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, also LinkedIn Live. And we will be discussing on March 27th. Thank you. And we will be discussing chapter 1.
So read along with us, or even if you haven't had time to complete your reading, it's just going to be Jess and I, and hopefully a loving community of commenters working through this together. And we invite you along for that ride.
Mm-hmm. Thank you to everybody who joined us. And Patricia, thank you. I was looking forward to the kickoff and also sweaty about it. And look, we did it.
Thank y'all.